6 degrees in Toronto. Now you're up to date. I'm Dan Turner, Chum News. Andy K. In for Russ McLeod. Good afternoon. It's 2:02 in Toronto.
Sounds like a dirty job, and one that can end up badly for everyone. Doesn't it sort of remind you of James and Percy? It was a splendid morning on the island of Sodor. James was feeling very pleased with himself. His red paint gleamed in the sunshine as he sped along the line. He reached the junction just as Percy puffed in with some freight cars. James was surprised to see him. "What are you doing here, Percy? You should be at the station by now."
He's Canadian. Yeah.
How do you know he's Canadian?
He talks like a Canadian, like me and all the other people. And there's another engine who is called Donald, and he's from the West, the Wild West. He has the same name as me, D-O-N-A-L-D, Donald, and he's a twin, like me.
I think people were looking for something that was totally nonviolent, totally interesting, a little bit educational because it teaches them about train travel and everything. I think he just came along at exactly the right time. Maybe he was discovered 40 years later, but I think that's why he's so magical.
Good morning. My talk is entitled Growing Up with Thomas the Tank Engine. My father's love of trains came from my grandfather, who was also a vicar. While Dad was still a toddler, my grandfather used to take him for walks, and they invariably ended up near the railway track, where they would stand and watch steam trains together.
Well, I suppose our childhood memory and lying in bed at night. One would hear a heavy goods from South Wales or elsewhere come into the station, stop and crow for a banker. The banker would come out of its shed, buffer up behind, and crow always be ready, and then the two engines would start off up the hill. And the boy's imagination, you could hear the two engines talking to each other. I can't do it, I can't do it, I can't do it, I can't do it. And the banker behind, oh yes you can, oh yes you can, oh yes you can. Yes, you can. And you'd hear them working their way up the hill. The goods engine complaining, and the banker saying in effect, you're making a fuss about nothing. You can do it, you can do it, you can do it, you can do it. And I suppose that childhood memory was the basis of these subsequent stories.
Winter came, and with it dark, heavy clouds full of snow. "I don't like it," said Thomas's driver. "A heavy fall is coming. I hope it doesn't stop us." "Pooh," said Thomas, seeing the snow melt on the rails. "Soft stuff, nothing to it."
Wilbert became a clergyman. He became a clergyman eventually, I suspect, because his father had become a clergyman. He had his second curacy. He was down in Wiltshire. He was quite a young clergyman. And he believed, with the outbreak of the Second World War, that he had to follow a pacifist line. He had to be a pacifist. Now, this wasn't a particularly popular thing to believe at the time. And Wilbert stood by this belief absolutely, determinedly, even though his own vicar said that he had to leave and go and find another parish.
When my brother Christopher was 3 years old, he had measles, and he had to be kept in a darkened room. So it fell to my father, who was a curate, working from home as it were, to entertain him. Well, they went through all the nursery rhymes, but they eventually lost their entertainment value from continual repetition, except for 2 rhymes. One of these was, early in the morning, down at the station, see the little engines all in a row. Along comes the driver, pulls a little lever, puff puff, peep peep, off we go. Dad drew very simple engine faces. He wasn't a very good artist, and he would do happy face, sad face, a cross face. But it was the sad face that appealed to Christopher, probably because he was feeling ill. What's that engine's name, Daddy? Edward, the first name that came into his head. Why is that engine sad, Daddy? Because he's old and he hasn't been out for a long time. Why hasn't he been out for a long time? Because all the other engines are bigger and stronger than him, and the drivers choose them first. And if you read Edward's Day Out in the 3 railway engines, you will see that that is precisely how it all began.
Once upon a time, there was a little engine called Edward. He lived in a shed with 5 other engines. They were all bigger than Edward and boasted about it. The driver won't choose you again, they said. He wants big, strong engines like us. Edward had not been out for a long time. He began to feel sad. Just then the driver and fireman came along to start work. The driver looked at Edward. "Why are you sad?" he asked. "Would you like to come out today?" "Yes, please," said Edward. So the fireman lit the fire and made a nice lot of steam. Then the driver pulled the lever and Edward puffed away. "Peep, peep," he whistled. "Look at me now."
The family were used as testers for the new stories being written. Dad would come to a meal complete with a script for a new story and would read it out to us to see what we thought. Sometimes we approved, and other times it wasn't right. And then we would get the story up to 6 times until we were happy with it.
This is a great occasion, really, isn't it? You're celebrating, something 50th. And it's 21 years since I saw your picture.
Yes,
you came along after we got to London. You finished with the last book,
yes,
with me when I left.
I think I was a bit of a midwife, really. I think that explains it, because I looked after the editorial side, the production, the costing, the design, the advertising, for those 26 years, really. My idea was, which I used in advertising in subsequent year, was this idea of small books for small hands. The idea of 4 stories in one little book was a very good idea in my view as bedtime stories, because parents in fact don't like to go through 64 pages. They would much prefer to go through 16 pages and stop.
The difficulty with the books really was the fact that although their shape was extremely unconventional, the 4 1/4 by 5 5/8, they were extraordinarily easy to sell because of the single opening of each page with a picture on one side and story on the other. And selling these books to a bookseller in a busy shop, you could speak to them over the pictures. They didn't read the text, they looked at the pictures.
Soon afterwards, a porter came and spoke to his driver. "Gordon can't get up the hill. Will you take Edward and push him, please?" They found Gordon halfway up the hill and very cross. His driver and fireman were talking to him severely. "You're not trying," they told him.
Were you surprised when the books became a great success?
Well, I was astonished. And I still am astonished.
This is all the Thomas treasures. It's the artwork from 38 books, right from the very beginning when Thomas the Tank Engine was written in 1946. My favourites, I think, are the C. Reginald Dorby artwork, the very early Thomas artwork, because I think it's the artwork that children appreciate. I think the colours are very bright, and they somehow are very friendly versions of the famous engines. Now, what would you like to see? I mean, do you want
to see some original manuscript?
Right. Well, when the manuscripts first came in from the Reverend Awdry, he wrote them by hand on the back of church circulars, and he did these funny little naive pictures, which showed that right from the very start he intended his engines to have faces. Originally, they were only written down because the Reverend Awdry's son used to remember the stories as his father told them to him, and he would correct his father if he varied from the original storyline. So his father wrote them down so that he couldn't be caught out.
Perhaps you better put that back and lock the safe up.
Yes, right. All safe and sound.
I gradually worked out under what disciplines the books were actually written. One book must follow on from another, and that the engines and scenery shown in one book should correspond with the scenery in previous books. And that created a problem which had to be solved. And that was only solved when we discovered the island of Sodor and standardized the scenery.
Wilbert Awdry had this obsession to understand the island of Sodor, a place where all these engines could run, and they could run authentically, so that there was no sense in which these were fictional engines. They were engines which followed their own true railway logic. Sodor is a great crossword puzzle. It's bringing together all these disparate, unrelated ideas and making them part of a whole new mythology. And there aren't many people who have done that. J.R.R. Tolkien, in creating Middle-earth, created his own land, his own language, his own geography, his own sense of place in which to put his stories. Wilbert Awdry is one of the few other people who has done that.
The engine's name was Henry. His driver and fireman argued with him, but he would not move. "The rain will spoil my lovely green paint and red stripes," he said. The guard blew his whistle till he had no more breath and waved his flags till his arms ached, but Henry still stayed in the tunnel and blew steam at him. "I'm not going to spoil my lovely green paint and red stripes for you," he said rudely.
There were other principles as well. First of all, they had to be accurate. In other words, the story, however offbeat, on which the stories in my book were based, had to have actually happened to some engine, somewhere, sometime. You remember the story of in Duck and the Diesel, how Duck crashed through a barber's shop. And the barber was quite calm about it. It's only an engine. Well, I got that from a page of offbeat accidents in the Railway Gazette. That actually happened at one of the Hull stations.
One of the engines in Edward's shed was called Gordon. He was very big and very proud. "You watch me this afternoon, little Edward," he boasted, "as I rush through with the express. That'll be a splendid sight for you."
My father did have problems with artists who didn't know anything about trains, and they would draw the same engine differently on several different pages. And of course small children are very quick to pick this up, and they write to the author and point out these mistakes.
Well, Awdry was fairly specific about which way he wanted the engines to face, and so you were stuck with having either the back end of an engine with no face on at all, or else some very peculiar view where you could just about see the face. But generally it was a fairly straightforward process, provided I remembered which way round engines faced on the railway line.
I suppose what struck me most about them was the incredible vivid colour. I mean, it seems like a rather banal thing to say, but if you think about the 50s, most books were fairly grey, and those books that weren't were printed on a kind of rather sort of browny paper, and maybe with just 2 or 3 colours. And there was something about these tank engine books that they were incredibly vivid, incredibly bright, and almost kind of glowing. Now, I mean, there's several moments in the Thomas the Tank Engine books that I can remember and I've carried with me for all my life. And I suppose one of the key ones is the moment when Henry gets bricked up in the very first of the Thomas Tank Engine books, the 3 railway engines. Now, this has just been handed to me, and I've just seen this for the first time for something like what must be 45 years. And I went, ah, this is incredible, because I've held the picture in my head, I've held the picture there, and then suddenly I'm seeing it, and it's an extraordinary thing in which the two things are meeting.
It's more real than we could possibly imagine, and it seems to remind us of a world that is gone. As you look at those drawings, first drawn by C. Reginald Dalby, you see those green hills and the blue distant mountains and the sea beyond, and you see the cows strolling through the meadows, and you see the children standing alongside the line waving at the trains as they go by. That is an evocation of an age that is gone, and it's always created in glowing iridescent colours, and those colours and those pictures leap off the page at you.
Some of the stones hit Henry's boiler and spoilt his paint. One hit the fireman on the head as he was shoveling coal, and others broke the carriage windows. It's a shame, hissed Henry. They've broken our glass, sobbed the coaches.
I'm scraping off glue that's imposing on the image of the painting, so I can clean it off, and it's good for reproduction. This type of series has got lots of glue damage. Some has had some kind of skinning of the surface. The paper's come off and I've had to replace the paper and paint over it. Or lots of the paint has popped off from the surface of the picture, and I've had to repaint the image.
The driver and fireman were drinking cocoa in the brake van. The guard pulled out his watch. "The kipper's due," he said. "Who cares?" said the fireman. "This is good cocoa."
"Boko, my dear engine," he gasped. "Save me!" Boko quickly sized up the situation and sent Bill and Ben about their business. They were cheeky at first, but Boko threatened to take away the trucks of coal he'd bought for them. That made them behave at once. Gordon thought he was wonderful. "Those little demons," he said. "How do you do it?" "Ah, well," said Boko, "it's just a knack." Gordon thinks to this day that Boko saved his life, but we know that the twins were only teasing, don't we?
Reading the stories nowadays, one does get the impression that, to begin with, say for the first 5 books, the stories are told on a much, no, not a much younger level, but on at a more young level than they later became. Father developed as a writer, of course, and I think the stories developed with him. He began to use more complicated plots.
And then you've got to remember that you're not merely writing for children, you're writing for the unfortunate people, mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, grandfathers, grandmothers, who've got to read the children the stories aloud, not just once, but over and over and over again. And so the story must be easy to read.
Henry comes home when it's his birthday. I just say happy birthday. There's this big hole where all the presents have to go in there. And there's trees and you know these bits on the top of the engines? Well, you know, what is it? I forgot now. Henry is chosen to take some fish to some place, and then he goes really fast and he slips off the line, and then he had new coal when he was going, and he got his old coal back, but he got a new shaping body.
That again and again the books are returning to the idea of order and who's in charge. And obviously we know the Fat Controller, that he's the big chief. And then we have the engines, and there's a hierarchy between the engines as to who's entitled to pull the express trains, and little Thomas the Tank, who thinks that he's a bit better than that. And then below that, below the level of the engines, you've got the carriages.
The passengers came and argued too, but Henry would not move. The fat director, who was on the train, told the guard to get a rope. "We'll pull you out," he said.
Drive up! Why are you late?
We ain't got no train left on our trailer.
I'm afraid that's not good enough. You're very late. You've thrown everything out of Canker.
Oh, very sorry.
I'll have to ask you to come and see me afterwards, okay? Who is the driver anyway?
Mr. Malcolm.
Malcolm? Harry Malcolm? Oh, well that explains a lot. Right. Tell him I'd like to see him afterwards.
Good.
I was rather annoyed with bureaucrats in high places who issued directives but didn't do anything themselves to help implement them. And that's what the first fat director was inclined to do. 1, 2, 3, push, he said, but didn't push himself. My doctor has forbidden me to push, he said.
There is certainly an analogy to be drawn between the fact that the engines are governed by a sort of omnipresent being, and if you care to equate the Fat Controller with God in that sense, then fine. I don't think really that that was the original concept, but Father being a clergyman, maybe it was a subconscious one.
Awdry's fed into them, really, the way in which children relate to adults. That's actually what you're talking about. You're talking about children in families and children in schools and the hierarchical world that children belong to, and younger children and older children. And Awdry very cleverly has, in a sense, taken those ideas about hierarchy and order and put them on to objects that we used to see around us the whole time.
I don't set out to write a moral story. When I was young, we used to, on Sundays, we used to have to read horribly boring moral stories about good little boys and girls who, in our opinion, my brothers and I opinion, wanted kicking rather than... They were so beastly good. And they were held up as moral examples. Well, my stories are nothing like that. The engines are have human characteristics. Like children, faced with a prohibition, as every child does, they push it and push it and push it to see how far they can go without bringing trouble on themselves. And then they do find it, but in my engines, they may be punished, but they're not scrapped. They have to express sorrow and intention of amendment, and then they're brought back into the family, so to speak.
Well, Thomas, so you and your driver have been fishing, but fish doesn't suit you, and we must get them out. So the driver and the fireman fetched rods and nets, and they all took turns at fishing in Thomas's tank, while the Fat Controller told them how to do it.
Thank you.
There we are. Your Callum, are you?
Yes. That's all right. No. That's lovely, isn't it? Thank you very much. I hope you'll enjoy that story.
In the early 80s, someone called Britt Allcroft came along. She is a businesswoman, and her children had loved the railway stories. The books had been going strong for over 35 years and were obviously here to stay. So she had talks with my father about making a TV series of the stories.
What first attracted me to the stories were and still are the characters, the adventures, the situations they get into. And this is what made me want to bring them to life on the screen, with all the things that a multi-dimensional world can do, with music and sound effects. And I think that the fact that that the characters are largely steam trains, although not all of them, has an appeal, because I think the sound of a train whistle has a universal appeal.
What we're waiting for is a whole parade of engines coming past the station, which you see. You've got Thomas, Toby and Percy, who are quite astounded by this great parade of engines coming past. This is the story where it's Fat Controller's engines, where actually all the major engines are all going off to London to a big show for all the kids. Pleasantly animated, looking at your sins here. Yes. I think that one probably shows the station structure better.
I think yes, if you had that. We've got three angles on there, haven't you?
The filmic translations of these things are very difficult in many ways, because there's a terrific difference from a chap sitting on an end of a bed telling a little chap in bed, which you probably know yourself, where you can stop between sentences and really get into detail because he's asking you the questions. In filming it, you've got to explain all the questions filmically there so that there's no mistake, there's no misunderstanding, and the story is clear.
One video is when Thomas wants to go fishing, and in the end he gets some water from the river and he gets fish in his boiler, and then they have to fish it out, and then they have a supper of fish and chips.
It was old and had 5 holes, so they had to fill it, pull it up and empty it into Thomas's tank as quickly as they could, several times over.
The TV series only started off because previously the engine series were bestsellers. Over the years, the engine series had got up to 8 million. It was only then that Bridolkoff and Co. thought it might be a good thing to cash in on.
Do you feel that those television programs are still your work?
No. Some of them, some of them are based rather loosely on my stories, but they're so obsessed with the popularity of Thomas that they have what I can only call crane-shunted Thomas to all sorts of unlikely places in order to get him into or force him into a particular story, whether the story was written with Thomas in mind or not.
I'm just doing some black and white initial ideas for Thomas's 50th birthday for the point of sale that we're going to be producing. The first one I came up with was having Thomas on a sort of like a landscape, just a flat piece of card that will have Thomas moving across and out to the trees and the bushes, which is quite a simple way that probably work using different mechanisms. But I think the one that's going to be most exciting is having Thomas coming out the shed and the doors opening at the same time.
I think we've probably published more than 50 million Thomas books all in all, if you count in the American and Japanese editions along with the English ones. Although Thomas had been very successful in the first 40 years, in the last decade sales have skyrocketed. And in very general terms, our own publishing revenues, which used to be in the environs of about $250,000 a year, are now probably $5 million a year.
Now on to customer promotions. Claire, we've got a good, we've had some good presentations with Smiths, Dillons, etc. How much commitment do you think we've got so far?
Well, I mean, they all say they're interested. I think, I mean, it's really now that we've got to get back to them and start firming things up. I think on the Smiths side, they said that they'd run a gondola promotion, didn't they?
That's right.
Good thing to do.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
we've got a budget of 100,000 above and below the line, so let's make the most of it. It's not often we get that sort of money to play with on our marketing budget.
That's good.
I just picked up, just starting from the book principle, Thomas Noisy Book, and I've had wonderful fun with this because we can hear the train and the coaches and the whistles and even a helicopter, and I don't know how he got in there, but that's the cops, and then my favourite.
Really useful engine. Really useful engine.
This, of course, is the fun part of the campaign. It's where we get Thomas Tank Engine onto the London city streets in the form of a London taxicab. And
Absolutely.
Having rolling round the city centre in London. This is the final design before it actually goes to the taxi company.
I think it works really well. I think the decals come up well.
Well, we even put them on the roof as well, so that people on buses can see it. I've got a feeling.
Brilliant idea.
I've got a feeling that a lot of city centre gents are going to get some pangs of
boyhood.
Exactly.
But of course, you've got a whole apparatus now that supports Thomas the Tank Engine. You've got the videos, you've got the TV programmes, you've got the posters, you've got the models. And that, in fact, of course, is like a great whole world that you can now inhabit.
If the audience embrace the characters and the stories, whom they first discover on the screen, maybe they first discover them in the books, but maybe they first discover them on the screen, that they will then want these characters and stories as part of their life, whether it be as toys or as a notepad or a pair of shoes or whatever.
It's the perfect product because it's not seasonal, it sells all the year round, but interesting enough also it allows you to produce a very good quality product. In turnover terms we do around £4.5 million a year on Thomas. He was very, very successful. In the States, for example, we'll probably sell around 12 million Thomas characters. But Thomas has gone to Australia, and Thomas is also very big in Japan now.
I think that stories have transcended national borders because basically they are universal, and small children are alike really all around the world. The gist is the strong storyline, the fun characters, and I think that in certain cultures where railways are a feature, such as in Japan and Norway, interesting enough, the series really has taken hold. I mean, it's interesting in Japan, the books were very popular long before the television series, and I do think that's because in Japan trains are a very important part of daily life.
日本におけるトーマスの市場規模で、過去何年かあるんですが、その中で一番大きかった年が約市場規模で170億円ほどの規模になりました。
機関車トーマス。トーマスとゴードンというお話。 トーマスは小さなタンク機関車、イギリスのソドー島の大きな駅で働いている。
子供たちはね、あれがイギリスのものだって分かっている子たちっていうのはいないと思うんですね。一緒に、ポンキッキという番組で放送されてるんですが、ポンキッキーズ、ごめんなさい、最近ポンキッキーズという番組になってタイトルが変わったんですけど、ポンキッキーズを見てるお母さん方もトーマスが
We have brought these stories on the screen to countries as diverse as Japan and the United States is in such a way as they can be embraced by people in those countries, and they're not kind of imposed on them. All our experience is that for instance in Japan, Japanese audiences embrace these characters and stories as their own. They become kind of indigenous to the country.
Brit has unfortunately written some of her own stories and sells them under the legend based on the Reverend Awdry's Railway series. Her stories are based on fantasy rather than fact.
The first two sets of videos were, in my mind, quite good because they stuck in the main to my stories. There's a success, I think, made the producers somewhat big-headed. And in the third series, they thought that they could write my stories for them. In so doing, they only revealed their lamentable ignorance of railway practice. For instance, the video called Henry's Forest.
Henry the Green Engine has lived on the island of Sodor for many years. He wouldn't want to be anywhere else.
The story was about Henry, an engine. Henry is, in that story, is enraptured by the forest which he goes through. Now, what interest does a steam locomotive have in scenery? On one occasion in the story, the driver says to Henry, "We've made good time over the last section, let's stop for a bit." Well, what responsible driver would stop as if he was in a roadside lay-by? You can't do it. They've shown a lamentable ignorance of Rule 55.
You're no stranger to Rule 55 then?
Well, I am strange to all the rules actually, because I have to refer to it, but you can tell me what Rule 55 is.
Rule 55 is a protection of trains when they come to a stand, reminding of the signalman of the position of your train, sending your fireman within a minute, 2 minutes to the signal box to sign the book and ensure that the signalman is aware of your position on the track. That's Rule 55.
Autumn was changing the leaves from green to brown. The fields were changing too, from yellow stubble to brown earth. As Thomas puffed along, he heard the chug, chug, chug of a tractor at work.
My father, a widower, now 83, still lives in his own home with a resident housekeeper carer. Dad has been called the Puff Puff Parson. He has even been called eccentric. The creator of these stories sometimes wonders whether he dreamt up Thomas or Thomas dreamt up him. But the Reverend Awdry is destined to be remembered as the Thomas the Tank Engine Man.
The children and their parents are still buying these books in thousands about an age that is gone. I'm on a par with Billy Bunter or William. Nobody goes to school at a place like Billy Bunter, and nobody lives nowadays in a sort of suburban house like Richmond Crompton's William. But there it is.
There's Thomas the Tank goes fishing, or there's Thomas the Tank and Henry the Green Engine. Now tell me, Katie, if he's right. You'd like one like...
I can see no end to it. I think it's great fun to sit back and watch other people being sceptical about it, when I have that gut feeling that Thomas will go on forever because I've worked with him for so long, and I have seen no evidence of children going off him.
How would you like to be remembered?
I'd like to be remembered as an author who perhaps understood children, perhaps how they, in a small sense, understood perhaps how their minds work. I don't know.